What's up, my wizards? It's Deb from SBMTG down there on the YouTube.com. We like magic, you know by now. And for the last week or so now, it feels like forever, I've been covering these Pro Tour decks, so it's time to get back to some original content. Last time I asked you guys what you'd want to see more, Indomitable Creativity or Mono Blue Control, and you guys always surprise me. Mono Blue Control won in a landslide. This deck went through a lot of evolution. When I first started building it, I went with like an improvised theme because I wanted to abuse Metallic Rebuke, because Metallic Rebuke is like objectively great, but that deck started feeling a little bit too similar to the $5 Mono Blue Pauper deck that I built just a couple weeks ago. So back to the drawing board. The next thing I tried was a Brain in the Jar deck that used Brain to like cast Baral's Expertise at instant speed and Rise from the Tides at instant speed. This deck was a little bit better, and I will say that casting Baral's Expertise at instant speed with Brain in the Jar and getting to counter a spell with that free spell, that's a really good play a lot of the time, but it still felt really gimmicky and it needed Brain to really be a good deck, and it just wasn't quite what I was looking for. In the end, I landed on a hardline control deck that may play a few expensive cards, but at the end of the day, still costs less than a third of what most of these like Pro Tour decks cost. You know, we're spending about $135 on this thing, so it's not incredibly budget, but at the same time, it's not going to cost you like $350, $400 like some of these really competitive decks out there. Still, you got a pretty good chance to win with this, but if you want a deck on a much lower budget, check out that $5 Pauper build that I made just a couple of weeks ago. And if you want a deck that actually costs a little bit more than this, but is even more competitive, and you like control decks, check out the blue-black control deck I made a couple of weeks ago too. So without further fully-coolly, let's proceed with Mono Blue Control on an intermediate budget. Let's do that. We'll start with 2 copies of Baral, Chief of Compliance, do a barrel roll. This guy gives us pretty much everything that a control deck wants. You know, he allows us to squeeze more spells into one turn, and he gives us some value for countering spells. That's just, all of that's really good. Now, the first thing I want to note about this guy is that he is not what you want to do on turn 2 most of the time. He's not really a turn 2 play. More often than not, you'll play this guy on turn 4 and go ahead and back him up with a 3-mana counterspell. Although you can play him on turn 3 and back him up with any one of our 2-mana counterspells too. But either way, you're very rarely going to play this guy on turn 2. The first line of text doesn't look too incredible or anything, but anyone that's played with Goblin Electromancer in the past knows that that first line of text is actually incredible. It allows us to like do a 3-mana Glimmer of Genius. That's really good. Or like a 2-mana Void Shatter. That's insane. That outclasses the actual original OG counterspell. So that's awesome. And the ability to loot and get extra value off of our counterspells is absolutely crazy. Like you'll counterspell and then loot into another counterspell to protect against their next play a lot of the time. So Baral is actually very nice once he does hit the battlefield, but do remember that you don't want to play him as early as possible. You want to wait until you can back him up. Couple of expensive cards coming up here, but there's only a couple of expensive cards in the deck, really. So, you know, like I said, I want to win. I want to give us the best chance of winning possible. So I feel like we got to play 4 copies of Torrential Gearhulk. Forgive me, please. Even though Torrential carries a pretty high price tag right now, at least it's going to stay that way, very likely until he's out of standard, which will be forever from now. So it's a safe investment. There's that. And there's also the fact that even though he costs so much and we're playing a full playset, we're still not going to spend like $150 on the deck. Again, we're spending only about $135. So he's over half the budget, but well worth it. We can't play a single better finisher than this right now. He's instant speed. He's a huge guy. He allows us to recast counterspells, Glimmer of Genius, and your removal and stuff. He allows us to recast Engulf the Shore, pop him back to our hand, and then cast him again. That's really, really good a lot of the time. So Torrential is just the absolute best thing that we could play. He's easily the best card in the deck, and he gives us the best chance of winning, so we gotta play him. Another expensive card here that I think we should probably play is the 2 copies of Jace, Unraveler of Secrets. I just want a Planeswalker to stay on board and do a couple of important things for a control deck, right? First of all, we can draw cards. We can scry and then draw. That's really, really good. And we can pop creatures back to our opponent's hand. That's also awesome. It's removal and card advantage on a stick, which is always good. You know, repeatable versions of these effects are exactly what a control deck wants, and the ultimate ain't half bad either. So I do want to make room for a couple of copies of Jace here, but I don't want to go overboard or anything, not just because of the budget, but because he's sorcery speed and he costs 5 mana. You know, that's the whole reason that I don't want to play like Baral's Expertise in this deck. You know, it's just, I don't want to play too many sorcery speed things, and as a matter of fact, Baral and Jace here are the only sorcery speed cards in the deck. 4 total sorcery speed cards. The rest can all all be played on our opponent's turn or in response to things. And that is very important for a control deck, especially one that doesn't have access to all the best removal in the format like we would if we were blue-black or Grixis or even Azorius. But sorcery speed nitpicks aside, he still has a bunch of repeatable effects, all of which are really good for a control deck, so I think Jace belongs here. Now let's get into the defensive stuff, though. Control deck's best weapon is often its counterspells, especially a mono-blue control deck. Well, that's pretty much the best thing we got going for us is our counters. So with that in mind, and considering we're playing Baral and we want to get as much value as we can, we're going to play 12 whole counter spells in this deck because, again, they're just our best defensive options. So let me show these to you. Now, on the low end of the spectrum here, so we can do things in the early game and keep stuff off the board, we're going to play 3 copies of Horribly Awry, 2 copies of Revolutionary Rebuff, and 1 copy of Negate. Now, 3 Horribly Awry might look like an awful lot, but I think that we could get away with playing 4 Horribly Awry right now in the main deck. I think it's totally possible because Mardu Vehicles is a force right now, obviously, if you didn't catch Pro Tour. Same thing with the Jund Energy and Green-Red Energy decks. Those are both very popular. This even counters everything all the way up to Felidar Guardian against the Saheeli decks. And there's a version of that Saheeli deck that plays 22 creatures. And they're all counterable by Horribly Awry. And it exiles the thing. So Horribly Awry is just so good. It counters Scrap Heap Scrounger and exiles it. That is incredibly important for this deck. So Horribly Awry is just maybe one of the best counter spells in the format, and I'll stand by that. I'll play 3 all day. This is a really good counter right this second. As far as Revolutionary Rebuff, it's not quite as good, but it can counter nearly everything except for artifacts, obviously. That keeps it from countering vehicles, but it can counter any creature they play in the early game, so it's basically 2 extra copies of Horribly Awry in that way, and it can counter things that aren't creatures. It can counter planeswalkers and stuff, so that's also somewhat important. For the most part here, I really just wanted another early game option that was a little bit more flexible than Horribly Awry, so ended up going with a 3-2 split here, but end of the day I wanted 5 early game counterspells. Now Negate costs 2, but it's not necessarily an early game counterspell. We'll use it to protect our Torrential Gearhulk or a Baral. Sometimes we'll use it to counter vehicles, and occasionally we'll use it to counter planeswalkers, so there's a ton of play on Negate, so much so that there's a couple of extra copies in the board. The card can be really, really good, and I wouldn't mind having an extra copy in the main. A little bit higher up on the curve here, we're going to play 4 Void Shatter and 2 Disallow right now. And Disallow is $10, which is ridiculous. I really don't... this thing should be $3, honestly. That really ought to go down, especially considering Control is not what we thought it was. And I know this is played in the Jeskai Saheeli deck, but I don't know why it's $10. I really don't. But with that in mind, I do think Void Shatter is in some ways the better counterspell, at least for this deck especially. Again, we have got to keep Scrap Heap Scrounger both off the board and out of the graveyard even. So Scrap Heap is so important right now, especially considering how good it is against this deck, that I want to play Void Shatter over Disallow. But, Disallow is still pretty important for countering activated abilities and triggers and stuff. Especially against planeswalkers, we kind of suck if they get on the board against us. So this can counter ultimates and stuff. That's really, really important too. So I do at least want to play a couple of copies of Disallow, but I'll play Void Shatter over it, if not just because of Scrap Heap Scrounger, but really anything that comes back from the graveyard. People are playing Liliana right now in the Delirium decks. People are playing Nissa Vital Force in that Jund deck that I just profiled the other day. So there's a lot of different ways to get stuff back from the graveyard. I think Void Shatter is excellent insurance against that right now. And as far as Disallow goes, we don't have to worry about Aetherworks Marvel or anything as much as we once did, or even at all anymore from what I've seen. So, unless you've got some people at your F&M that have switched from Imrakul to Ulamog and they're just playing the exact same Aetherworks Marvel deck, then you shouldn't have to worry about Disallow, being strictly better or really better at all than Void Shatter. I think Void Shatter is just the better counter right now. Now that's a lot of counter spells, but stuff will inevitably slip onto the board at some point, so we got to play some amount of removal. And here's where Mono Blue will flag just a little bit. If we had black or white or red, some sort of access to good hardline removal, that would be awesome, but we got to use whatever we have at our disposal here. But good news is we've got some at least decent stuff. Let me show it to you here. We're going to play 3 copies of Engulf the Shore in the deck, 4 copies of Disperse, and 3 copies of Aether Meltdown. Now, Engulf the Shore is great, and I would not mind playing 4 as a matter of fact, with all the aggro decks in the format, but we are packing that 4th one in the sideboard for when we do come up against those really fast decks right now. But it is just fantastic. It can clear the board as early as turn 3 if you played a turn 2 Baral. But even on turn 4, this can help you reset the game very, very well and allow you to like counter any other creatures that they play from then on, counter creatures that they're recasting. So Engulf is great. Disperse is actually standard legal. It's in the Welcome 2016 deck, and Gatherer says that it's standard legal. So I'm going to play it. It can get any permanent. That's really important against everything, literally, artifacts, planeswalkers, and creatures included. And even though it's just a bounce, we can always do the thing where we bounce something and then counter it once we have the counter spell up for it. So, that's a thing. Tempo is important. Getting things off the battlefield when they're trying to attack us is important. So, even though it's not the best removal ever, I think Disperse is maybe one of the better options we have in mono blue. Now, Aether Meltdown doesn't play incredibly well with Engulf the Shore, but it's still that important in the early game that I'm going to play it, The fact that this has Flash is really awesome because it just plays like an instant speed removal spell in a lot of ways. It also gives us energy for something that's in the board. We'll talk about that in a second. But mostly it's good because it's great against vehicles and it's decent against the green-black counters deck. I think Meltdown is just that important in the early game so we can pack as much, cheap removal as possible. So we've seen our win conditions, we've seen our removal, and we've seen our counter spells. There's just one more thing that control decks like to play, and that's card advantage. So with that in mind, I'm just going to finish off the main deck here, basically, with 4 copies of Glimmer of Genius. Now, yeah, we could play a number of copies of Anticipate, anywhere between 1 and 3, we'll say, but I didn't find room for Anticipate. I want all the Torrential Gearhulks, I want to play a couple of Barals in the deck, I want our Planeswalker, I want all of our counter spells, and I want all of our removal. All that's so important that in the end I just couldn't find room for Anticipate. But you definitely play Glimmer of Genius. This also produces energy. That'll get important when we get to the board, but mostly it's just insane card advantage. Getting to fix a couple of draws, then drawing 2 cards is just woof. Like that's so good. And the fact that we can recast this with a Torrential Gearhulk can be great. We get a huge guy and we get a head on card advantage. Just insane play, and I still think this is probably the best thing that draws cards in the format, unless you're packing a bunch of artifacts, and you can play Reverse Engineer. We're not doing that, so Glimmer of Genius is sort of the de facto choice. We're playing 26 lands in this deck right here because we've got to hit our land drops. We're a control deck. Now, we don't have to split a bunch of different colors of mana or anything, or really even 2 colors of mana. So I think we can play 1 or 2 fewer lands than control decks like to play, but 26 lands is about as low as I'm willing to go because we've got to get to a 6-drop on turn 6, at least reliably, and we've got, if we miss a land drop in the early game, we're done. So I want to make sure we get those drops. I'll play all 26 here. Actually, before I'm done with the lands, I just want to point this out too. It's also nice to play a high land count so that you'll have something you can at least comfortably discard when you're discarding with Baral. When you loot, when you counter a spell, it's nice to be able to discard a land and not feel too bad about it. So there's that too. Here's our worked and reworked sideboard. Mono Blue has a lot of different options for its sideboard. But we are going to play all 4 Ceremonious Rejections. This protects against all the random artifacts in the field right now, but it also mostly protects against vehicles, which a lot of the aggro decks are going to pack at least 5 or 6 of. So Rejection is just great against Heart of Kiran and stuff like that. Definitely play it. At least 3 copies, but I went with all 4 because we were that bad against those decks. Dispel is good in the control mirror, but it's also decent against like Unlicensed Disintegration and Shock and all that stuff, But mostly Unlicensed Disintegration against our Baral is something we really don't want to happen, so Dispel's good against that play too. We're going to play a couple of copies of Negate in the board. It's nice to have a whole 3 copies after board so that we can deal with mostly Planeswalkers, but also vehicles. This will often come in against the vehicles decks too. We're going to fill out the playset of Aether Meltdown right here because Aether Meltdown is just great against those vehicles decks again and anything that's really low to the ground aggro. Now I'm going to play 3 copies of Dynavolt Tower in the board. This is the thing that we need the energy for. And of course Dynavolt Tower will also produce its own energy, but this is just going to come in not only against some aggro decks. Okay, I won't always put it in against aggro, but sometimes it'll come in against aggro, and it's really good. Mostly, here it is, against the control decks. If you can get it safely onto the board, they don't have a whole lot of options to answer it, and it'll slowly but surely kill those control decks that you come up against. So it's a really good card in the mirror match, from at least my experience. But you don't want to play Dynavolt Tower early either. Usually this is a turn 5 or 6 play as well, so keep that in mind. And I'm also playing Sphinx of the Final Word against control decks, exclusively against control decks. So if you didn't notice by that sideboard overview there, we've mostly got stuff to deal with aggro, but there's also a few tweaks we can make against control, like Tower and Sphinx. Here are your power rankings right here. Final score of 60, which is not too bad, honestly, for a deck. It's like 135, something like that on TCG Player right now. And it's got all the foibles in the power ranking system that a control deck normally does. You know, it doesn't care about speed, doesn't care about offense. That adversely affects the score disproportionately, really. As it stands, we've only got counterspells and some relatively subpar removal spells. But that being said, we've still got Torrential Gearhulk, one of the better cards in the entire format. We've got Baral to make our spells cheaper and give us some value. You know, we've got Jace to draw us cards and return creatures. So we've got a lot of really, really powerful effects in this deck. And as far as mono blue control decks go, I think this is probably the best build that'll give you the best chance of winning available in this format, because I tried a bunch of different builds, and this is definitely the most successful one. And that's probably because it just plays like a regular control deck, you know? We've got, instead of like gimmicks and tricks with artifacts and brain in the jar and trying to cast sorceries as instants and stuff, we're just going to go the traditional route and do what, you know, control decks do. We're going to just draw cards, we're going to counter spells, we're going to remove stuff, we're going to play a huge guy at the end of the game that gives us value in some way. And the deck does all of those things pretty well, so try it out. It's not the most expensive control deck ever. It's probably, again, the cheapest control deck that'll give you the best chance of winning. And with that, I'm tapped out. That's all I got to say about this deck. I hope you enjoyed it. A lot of you were really looking forward to mono blue control, and I have done my absolute best to give you, again, the best deck that I could have possibly put together with this theme here. So go forth, try it out, proxy it up, let me know how you feel, and then address me in the comments section, the sideboard down there, and let me know how you felt about it, how it could be built differently, all that stuff. But what are we doing next time? Well, next time, I'm going to bring you the other deck that I wanted to bring you the other day. It's going to be the Indomitable Creativity deck. This is the weirdest deck that I've shown you all season long. Guaranteed. This is a very, very weird deck, and I can't wait to show it to you because I'm super stoked about it. This may be my favorite deck all season, and we've done some crazy stuff that I like a lot so far. So stay tuned for that. Should be in your inbox in there in the next couple of days. We're going to get that up, and I seriously can't wait to give it. I cannot wait. Cannot wait. But as far as this video goes, if you enjoyed the content, you can always hit the like button. Thumbs up helps me out a lot. You can share this video to all your Magic playing buddies, or even people you know that don't play Magic. Just be like, hey, check this fat guy out. He's pretty funny. But in any case, you can just, you know, sub if you're new, hit the bell for the notifications, and I will learn to speak English eventually. I'm Devin from SBMTG. Thanks for watching, my wizard.